Well, folks, President Trump just moved another chess piece on the board in his fight for the Save America Act and election integrity. Now, it came in the July 29th letter that was signed by the 23 Republican governors. Now, if you read that letter alone, it looks like a political endorsement, but it arrived after executive orders, DOJ action, state pressure, and a growing fight inside of the Republican Senate. And I do not believe that those stories are isolated. The governors just made the state level part of the same election integrity campaign visible. Now, before we get to the whole board, we need to see what these 23 governors actually did. Like I said, the letter is dated yesterday and it was addressed to the president. It carries the signatures of 23 Republican governors. And those governors support the budget resolution as a first step. Okay. The letter also addresses defense funding, farm assistance. So it isn't accurate to pretend this is a document about, some single bill. It's also not final law. Okay. A governor's signature doesn't amend the federal election law. A budget resolution starts the reconciliation process, but the committees still have to develop the legislative language, and Congress and the Senate still have to act. So what did this letter change? Okay, because I don't see it really being talked about at all, but it's important. Okay, it changed the political alignment. 23 governors, they put their names behind the vehicle. They placed their states publicly inside of the fight. And they gave President Trump another source of pressure on John Thune, on the Senate. That's what the letter did. Now we can see what it joined. And politically, the direction of that pressure matters. Okay, this is no longer only Washington telling the states what the administration wants. We have governors inside of the executive branch of the states now telling Washington what they want the federal process to be doing. The letter doesn't guarantee that every governor will fight for every provision, but it does create a public commitment that voters can test. A governor who signed this letter can now be asked what he is doing to move his own senators, and that turns his signature into a pressure point. Months before these governors signed anything, President Trump was already moving through the executive branch. Executive Order 14399 that directs federal agencies towards citizenship verification, the transmission of relevant eligibility information to state elected officials, and the prioritization of election fraud investigations and prosecutions. Another important fact that matters, because the states administer these elections, but federal elections still operate under federal law. Trump's order creates a federal direction, tells the agencies to use the authority that they already have, transmit information the states may need, and prioritize enforcement where federal election law is implicated. And this is a pattern that I've seen with the president. His genius, he's getting leverage. He's forcing institutions to respond, and he rarely makes a single move for a single reason. The order creates direction. The next move creates consequence. Now, the DOJ has an active election integrity enforcement front that involves the voter roll access and federal election offenses. That changes the environment for state officials. Federal request can't be buried now as some quiet administrative disagreement, especially when it produces litigation or an investigation or even a public response. Every state now has to make a choice: cooperate, fight, or explain. Explain why its existing procedures are enough. And every response gives Trump something. Okay? When a state cooperates, the administration can point to it as a model. When it refuses, the admin can say that's resistance and it's part of the political argument. When the dispute reaches a court, judges begin defining the boundary between federal authority and state election administration. They see separate lawsuits and requests. I see pressure forcing the issue into the open. And state cooperation is where federal direction either becomes real or stays on paper. Federal government can provide information, file cases, they can enforce federal statutes, State officials, though, have to control the records, the procedures, the machinery, all the stuff that makes the election administration work. That means Trump doesn't need every state to agree with him. He needs every state to just take a position. Cooperation will advance policy. Resistance creates a public fight, and litigation will create the ruling. In each case, the issue moves, doesn't stay stagnant. Okay? It doesn't disappear into the bureaucracy. But executive action and DOJ enforcement, they can't do everything. If Trump wants a durable national framework, the Senate will have to move. Now, the White House describes the Save America Act as requiring the proof of citizenship, okay, to vote, for federal registration, and ID. Okay? If you strip away all that language and the public question stays simple. Should the system verify that a person registering for a federal election is eligible to vote in the United States? Because the American people have already answered the central part of that question. Look at Pew. 83% of Americans supported requiring photo ID. Gallup also reported broad support of a photo ID and proof of citizenship when someone first registers. That doesn't mean 83% of Americans signed off on every line of the SAVE Act, but it means voter ID and voter verification are not fringe demands. The American people want free and fair elections. We want voter ID. I say this day after frickin' day. We want eligible voters protected. We want ineligible voters prevented. We want rules that people can understand, all before a ballot is cast. That's the kitchen table issue. People aren't sitting at home studying these reconciliation procedures. We want to know whether our vote counts under rules that apply to everybody. And that's exactly why the Senate problem is becoming harder for Senator Thune to hide. According to the AP, Thune said Republicans didn't have the votes to pass the bill or get around the filibuster. Trump responded by pressing Thune over the August break and demanding that the Senate remain in session until the voting bill passed. That keeps the conflict out in the open. I think we all know if Thune doesn't do something, that Trump is going to cancel their August recess. There's only a couple days left. Trump is demanding action. The White House has put the legislation forward. The executive branch is already applying pressure. The DOJ is pursuing enforcement. The central voter verification policies have broad public support. And Senate Republican leadership is still saying the votes aren't there. It makes the Senate the bottleneck, not the governors, not us, the Republican Senate. The vote problem may be real, okay, we know that. But a private vote, well, that protects everyone. Every holdout gets to hide from accountability. A public vote, well, forces each senator to own his position or hers. That's why we don't just settle with, we don't have the votes. It's not enough anymore. Now, which provisions are stopping them? Which senators are objecting? What change would produce a vote? That's what we need to know. Senate leadership can answer those questions without pretending the process is complete. That's the part that this governor's letter changes. Before then, the administration could point to executive action, federal enforcement, legislation, and public support. Now, it can also point to the executive branch in every one of these 23 states who publicly backed the vehicle. Governors didn't pass the law. They created a visible state-level coalition, which is genius. It gives Trump political cover to keep pushing. It tells Republican senators that this demand isn't confined just to the White House. It gives the Republican voters a list of governors who can now be asked whether they're willing to pressure the senators or if they were just willing to sign on. That's why I don't need to read this as some ceremonial letter. I read it as a serious leverage point. And do I have a secret memo proving that all these actions were planned in the same room? I don't. But I've spent enough time around President Trump to recognize this is a operation of his. He identifies an issue that we care about. He raises the stakes and he forces institutions to respond. Then he makes the opposition, sometimes his own party, decide whether they're with him or standing in his way. That's what we're watching. The executive order establishes the direction, DOJ creates enforcement, federal investigations and litigation force states to respond, state cooperation turns policy into implementation, and the SAVE Act applies the legislative framework. The governors create a public state-level coalition, and Senate, well, they understand that the pressure is going to move them, okay? There aren't 7 copies of the same action. There's 7 different pressure points moving towards the same objective. Once you put them together, you can see how genius this board is and how it's moving. Folks, if you want the strategy behind the headlines instead of another isolated headline, subscribe to the channel, okay? Now, the response from the critics is very predictable. The governor's letter is symbolic. The budget resolution isn't law. The federal government is overreaching, and states have constitutional authority over their elections. Some of that is true. The letter is not a statute. Reconciliation is not complete. Courts can limit federal demands. An administration can create a political fight without producing final legislation. But none of that makes the pressure imaginary. The states are responding. The courts are hearing the disputes. The governors are taking sides. Trump's pushing Thune. And Republican senators still have to explain why they can't move an election integrity priority that their own voters support en masse. That's the contradiction. If voter rolls are maintained properly, well, verification should be defensible. If the legislation is flawed, they should show what needs to be changed. If the voters aren't there, or if the votes aren't there, you need to publish the count and name the holdouts. We aren't going to accept the status quo anymore. Now, going to keep going, right? The coalition is going to keep pressuring the Senate from outside Washington, but Trump is still going to apply pressure from inside the federal government. And this is how he's changing the battlefield. Trump doesn't need every move to produce the final one, okay? He just needs every move to force the next institution to react publicly so the voters can see what's going on. The media sees a letter, Trump sees an opportunity, and he sees a coalition where 23 governors are going on record. This is how we move. Not chaos, it's leverage. So, folks, from here on, I'm watching 4 things. The legislation, okay? The text that's actually moving through reconciliation. Second, the public getting a real floor date instead of another promise from the Senate and no commitment on when they're going to get to this. Third, publishing the vote count. Okay, if Republican senators are refusing to move, well, the votes should be cast and we should know their names. And fourth, watching these governors. Their signatures matter more than, many other things that they can do, but only if those that signed it are willing to call the holdouts and demand action. That's where this is going to get uncomfortable for the Republican establishment. It's easy to support election integrity in a press release. It's harder to force your own party to take a recorded vote. We aren't asking for something radical. We're asking for elections that are free, fair, secure, and trusted. President Trump has moved through executive action, enforcement, the states, and legislation to keep the fight alive. Now 23 Republican governors have signed. The next move belongs to you, John Thune. Publish the real vote count, dude. And every senator who says they support election integrity, put your name on it in public. All right, folks, give me all you got in the comments. I'm interested. Are we beating this Save America, Save Act to death? Or is this something you guys want to hear about? Because holy crap, is it tiresome to me. I know the answer. We got to keep in front of us, but dear Lord, John Thune, do something.